Hello, and welcome to Scottish Adult Adoptee Movement. And today our speaker is going to be Dr. Gary Clapton. Now, Dr. Gary Clapton's title of his presentation today is called Birth Fathers Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow, the Personal, the Professional and the Research. Now, Gary is a qualified social worker and has worked with children and families in Edinburgh and London. He has taught and researched in academia since 2003. He has published widely, mainly on fathers and adoption. He has a particular critical interest in children and family social work. His research and publications have also included moral panics, social work education, and believe it or not, what it means to wait in general practice surgeries. So Gary, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah Louise. Very kind of you.
You're welcome.
I think I have published wildly as well as widely. And so I'm happy for both, actually, happy for both. So I want to say thank you to the organisers and good afternoon. You'll find out a bit more about me as I go on. So I want to start by repeating the title. This is about birth fathers yesterday, today and tomorrow. And begin with saying this. I was never forgetful of the fact that as a 19-year-old, I'd helped conceive a child, been there at her birth on Christmas Day 1969, and was involved in her being adopted out. Most of the memories from that time are vivid, and some have, if that's possible, only become more painful as I've got older. Within 2 years of my daughter's adoption, I was looking after 2 3-year-old children. 13 years after it, I was step-parenting a young teenage girl. I eventually became a social worker who was involved in adoptions. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. I can trace the connections only now. For me, adoptions cast a long shadow. For 20 years after my daughter was adopted, I was unable to contemplate having another child. There are other milestones in my life that I can attribute to the effect of having given up a child for adoption, such as birth fathers being the subject of my doctoral thesis. But probably the biggest milestone came in 1993 with the arrival of the letter that began, "I'm writing to you on behalf of someone who believes that they may be related to you." I knew right away who that was. As you can tell from this, I'm one of those birth fathers from the era of closed or secret adoptions. And this period and the men that lived through it have been the main subject of my work and studies. I'll return to the issue of birth fathers involved in today's, mostly from council care, today's adoptions. But what do we know now about birth fathers? What does the accumulated research tell us? Well, triggered by my daughters reaching out to me, I began my research to try to understand my experiences. I could find next to nothing about birth fathers in the 1990s. I didn't even know then I was a birth father, or more to the point, I didn't call myself one. My book that came out in 2003 remains the only one that's researched the experiences of birth fathers. But to be brief, a snapshot of the birth father experience, what we know now from the research, includes 3 essential insights. Firstly, the traditional image of birth fathers is that they're feckless and fly-by-night characters with no sense of responsibility. That might be a correct appraisal in some cases, but in the main, it seems from the research anyway, speaking of the adoptions in the 1960s and 1970s, as a guide, the closed ones in which infants were adopted out, birth fathers were young guys and likely to be in stable and loving relationships with their girlfriends prior to the birth of their adopted child. There's been some latest research in Australia It's about a couple of years old now, but it is the latest, and it confirms much of what we know. And I'm going to quote from him rather than try and toggle backwards and forwards through my PowerPoint. I'm going to abandon the PowerPoint display because I find that the share screen does get into interrupting the kind of flow of things. And the quote I've picked out here is this one from one of the respondents in the Australian research to birth fathers. We were then left as two 16-year-olds to deal with what had happened and try to recover the relationship we once had with absolutely no support. I still cry about the loss. During the run-up to the birth and adoption and just afterwards, researchers found that birth fathers were ignored, marginalised or actively excluded. The evidence counters the stereotypes of older men who abandon women and challenges the stories of these mostly young men. It doesn't challenge, confirms the stories of some of these young men who were striving to stay involved in the pregnancy and birth and after, but were prevented from doing so. My second insight from what we know now, my work and subsequent studies, they continue to unlock our understandings of birth fathers. And this body of research has revealed evidence of long-lasting grief, but also the minutiae of little private ceremonies and commemorations on crucial dates, candles lit on birthdays that were always remembered, Christmas days as well as the big stuff, such as the birth of subsequent children, triggering distress produced by the earlier loss of a child by adoption. In one study, nearly 80% of the birth fathers that were spoken to agreed that the emotional impact of the adoption was deeper and more lasting than anything else that had happened to them in their life. So the notion that for men, out of sight, out of mind, it is challenged in these fathers' talk and expression of feelings and thoughts of their child over the years and decades since the adoption. A deeply felt connection remains. They feel like fathers. This is often buried or left unexpressed, and such suppression can cast a long and negative shadow in subsequent choices, relationships, and the lives of these birth fathers. One of them in the Australian research that I talked about said this: well, to be honest with you, it haunts you. Over the years, I've often thought about it, and you get it. You walk around town and you look. You're constantly looking, thinking, could that be her? Could that be her? Another one said, no, there's no closure. It's still this open, gaping wound, which is getting torn apart, probably more and more every day. Now, one of the men in my study, 20 years after the adoption of his child, was straightforward. The adoption rubbed me out legally, but not emotionally. As well as these enduring feelings, there are material effects. These include poorer mental health, complications in subsequent relationships, difficulties in deepened pleasure over a second child in their lives, but also the decision not to have any further children. And, as I mentioned before, adoption influenced career choices, such as opting for employment and care or children's sectors. A pervasive theme runs through this Australian study I was talking about, but how each father saw themselves as a father, and what their adopted child thought of them now, and whether they could achieve closure. The concept of fatherhood is complex for fathers who might not have seen or had contact with their biological child. Changes in identity linked to fatherhood and the assumption of responsibility of a father or denial of this role were significant issues in this research that many fathers had to contend with. An observation that emerged from the research was the perception of some fathers regarding their place in their adopted child's lives. And whilst a majority readily admitted that their child's father was indeed the child's current adoptive father, some inadvertently made contradictory statements during their interviews. Some fathers indicated that they still saw themselves as a child's father, with some making statements that they missed taking their child to school. They saw that as a father's responsibility. One father described how he saw himself as the father of both his adopted daughter and his other biological children. And as I said, out of sight is not meant out of mind with the birth fathers that we researchers have spoken with. I went further and had a look at with some of the men I interviewed and subsequently men that I've worked with in my capacity as a worker in an after adoption organisation. And I looked at reunions, and the reunions, that is getting together when adopted people search for and contact their birth parents, in particular the birth fathers. These reunions with birth fathers give us a further glimpse into the world of birth fathers and how we see ourselves, because very often these meetings come about through the efforts of adopted children to find their fathers. A couple of researchers talk about this. They say that in adoption, there's always been two mothers and two fathers, in theory. Contact between adopted people and birth parents does not create this. Rather, it gives material and social expression to what was only an abstraction. Although it's a fact that everyone involved has to negotiate, adopted people seem to manage this, whereas some birth mothers sometimes struggle with the desire to nurture and be maternal. Now, the birth father literature on reunions is sparser than that of birth mothers, but there's somewhat less ambivalence, I find. One guy said, well, I'm his father, but I'm not his dad. For me, this means complexities such as not being invited to my daughter's wedding, but being a well-loved birth granddad. Now, my third final observation that comes from the research is about the essentials of the birth father experience being much the same. There are many similarities between those for birth mothers, and whether a forced adoption took place, whether the child was relinquished, removed. And these include the severity of the impact of the adoption and the feeling of having no say or choice in the matter, a lifelong persistence of grief, complicated by the feelings of being disenfranchised, shame, guilt, and further being compounded by ambivalent feelings of still being a parent and experiencing the continued psychological presence of the child in their lives. Birth mothers and birth fathers have that in common. As a result of the increasing accounts and weight of evidence, this research evidence about these adoptions and birth fathers and those directly involved, across the English-speaking world now, while still there are babies being adopted by non-relatives, former assumptions of adoption being a practice in which adoptive couples might raise an infant as if born to them, previous practices of closed records and secrecy, marginalisation of birth parents, especially birth fathers, have all come in for challenge, criticism and review. Birth mothers' voices are heard now and respected. For adopted people, adoption is no longer seen as a one-off event. Instead, it's rightfully regarded as a lifelong process, and birth fathers like me are invited to the table now. However, adoption itself is changing. I put quote marks around this, new birth parents are in the process of being created. Now, an increasing proportion of adoptions involve children from state care who have been removed from their parents and consent to adoption dispensed with. Clifton, researcher in East Anglia, conducted interviews with 20 of these contemporary fathers whose children were adopted from state care. He found that whether through relinquishment or compulsory adoption, most birth fathers seemed to have played a marginal role, and most fathers felt humiliated by the interventions, court procedures, and the compulsory adoption of their child. One man was quoted as saying by the researcher, "I don't think they took me seriously from day one, really. They didn't really get to know me. So there's probably times I just thought, yeah, they don't care about me being involved. I'm nothing, I'm scum." Importantly, Clifton, the researcher, identified ways in which these fathers managed their social emotions. Shame and guilt appeared to determine outcomes for them and their future relationships with their child. But his birth fathers were reluctant to talk about their experiences. And given what I've said about the earlier generation of birth fathers, it's depressing to note that so much less is known about birth fathers today who may have been subjected to the humiliating experience of compulsory adoption. As food for thought now, I want to wind up with two matters that pertain directly to birth fathers of both my generation and those of today. Firstly, it remains the case that fathers as a whole tend to be marginalised in social work thinking and practice. Researchers in a recent report about care proceedings in England suggest that failure to support men to be involved or better fathers, regardless of whether they live with their children or not, impacts on children both now and in the future. Also, they described services for fathers as being generally limited, localised, reliant on short-term funding, or the actions of a particularly committed practitioner. Their report also indicated that there are a lack of post-removal and pre-birth services explicitly set out to include fathers, or even creative thinking in adapting parenting programs to the needs of fathers without children in their care. This persistent failure to, bring fathers into the picture feeds through into adoption, where efforts to involve fathers are patchy and a mirroring of how birth fathers in the past were ignored. This contemporary sidelining of birth fathers in adoption needs to be addressed and resolved urgently, if in 30 years' time we're not to witness the same kind of discovery of distress and pain for these men, as has been the case for the likes of me and other birth fathers whose children were adopted in the 60s and 70s. But my second matter takes a step back and poses this question. What do we mean by the word birth father now? Birth mothers and I use the term carefully, and I've long railed against the term birth mothers, one of the worst being tummy mummy. In today's adoptions, during the prospective pre-birth phase in which social services may be involved, a man can be an expectant father, and then a father at the birth of his child, and he may even be the dad for a while, but during and after adoption proceedings, he becomes the birth father in a process of othering, objectification, and marginalisation. He can be stuck with this label all his life unless he and his adopted out child have later life contact. He then may very well become a father again, and should a relationship develop, he might even be called one of two dads. These changes in adoption since the decline of secrecy increasingly make the phrase, perhaps not in relation to the likes of me in the 60s and the 70s, but today increasingly the phrase birth father is a blurred concept for me. Oh, and that letter from someone who believes that they may be related to me that I began with, cut to today. We've become family. My daughter's family has multiplied to include her Scottish connections. And I embrace my Norfolk child, now a 53-year-old fantastic mum of 3. I'm mates with her husband, and I love their children, my grandchildren. For nearly 30 years since she got in touch with me, my daughter and I have exchanged letters. And I might not have been her dad all these years when she was growing up, but being a father is so much part of my living identity now that I no longer hesitate when asked how many children I have. I'm out and proud about my 2 sons that I've raised and my daughter that I didn't. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Gary. Thank you so much. So I would like to ask a question, if that's okay. And I'm sure the other panel would like to ask some questions. But one of the questions that I would like to ask is, do you feel, because there is such a movement now, there is such a voice coming through, do you feel that, and does it bring you hope that fathers will start to create a community within themselves, and they will start to be able to help each other? Because I know that women, we talk, we gas, we never shut up. And men, they don't have that space. And we've even found that in the adoptee community, that there's a real lack of just male voices for them to have a community. So that's my question to you.
Sure. Thank you. Sometimes when I'm really pleased to be invited to events like this, but I sometimes feel like a kind of professional birth father, like a panda in a zoo in a way, right? Where people come along and poke things through the doors and the bars and say, "Oh, is that what one of them looks like? Is that how he talks?" Right? So I often feel like I've got 2 heads, and I've been working with fathers, birth fathers, for 20 years now. And to be honest, Fee, there is no evidence that birth fathers are coming together as a group. Certainly, we're being invited to the table more. In Australia, there's some strong voices. There is always some strong voices in the States. It's much less so the case. I still think it remains an individual hoe that I row. So fathers in general, well, even there's a kind of a lack of sort of, that ability to sort of start networking quickly and sharing, right? I mean, we guys don't do that very well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So,
Does any other panel members have any questions?
So, Gary, yeah, I just wanted to ask you, what initially drew you to this type of research?
See that? I didn't hear that last bit. What about the research?
What was it that drew you to this type of research
Okay. Like I said,
specifically?
I know. I mean, at the time, I just could not understand when I opened the letter from my daughter. Here was I, as I said, I didn't know what birth father was, but I knew what I was experiencing. Somebody was getting in touch with me. My daughter was in touch with me. I was awakened as a kind of father. It had been latent, but I'd been awakened as a father again. I was yet to have my two boys that I brought up, but here was I in the midst of a turmoil of emotions. And you obviously go on the internet, and back then it was a bit clunky, and search about, but I could not find anything until I actually come across something from the States and something from Australia. 1993 in Australia, 1987 in the States. And I started to read about what I was going through. I started to read things that what sort of resonated with my experience. And then, well, I don't know, maybe I'm a born academic, but I've been a practitioner all my life as a professional life. But I'm always curious. I was always curious about, what made me tick. And this brought it to life.
I see. That answers that.
I have a question, Gary. I wondered if your research had unearthed any differences between whether sons or daughters were born as to how much of a gap was felt with the child not being there.
That's a really interesting question because there is none. There is some research about fathers' experiences with meeting their daughters, but there's nothing that's compared the two. There's nothing that's actually, because it's actually quite difficult. I'd have to have had a son and a daughter and then have a kind of, what's it called in research, a control group, right, to find out how both had went. But it's actually fascinating to sort of think about how that works. What seems to be the case is that, and this is a broader point, and Lindsay, a broader point is that sons and daughters seem to give birth fathers an easier time of it than they give birth mothers. That birth mothers, and this goes a wider discussion about how we look on women and sexism and so on. Birth mothers seem to get, there's obviously a material basis for it, seem to get the tough questions. I got the tough question, why did you give me up? But birth mothers seem to get, a bigger grilling, and birth fathers, in my research and in my experience as a professional, seem to get a little bit kind of more off the hook, right? And don't get so much of a grilling. But as for whether, and so therefore it follows that sons, being guys, tend not to sort of like spend too much time sort of looking at, their fathers and sharing emotions, but would rather go to football and hang out. Whereas the girls, I know I'm being very stereotypical here, maybe tend to give the fathers that wee bit more, so what happened? And certainly in my case, I was put through the mill about why didn't you give me up? Why didn't you take me, on your travels around the world? And, you could have done this, you could have done that. I was in tears within an hour of us meeting at Waverley Station in Edinburgh. And I sometimes don't have an answer for why I gave her up. There's times in my life, I've got an answer and times I haven't. And then I was kind of stuck for words, but I managed to stutter out something. So to go back to my earlier point, though, I do think that it's just a notion of mine. I think that I think mothers get a wee bit of a harder time.
Thank you very much for your answer. That's really intriguing hearing that there's been a kind of journey where you've experienced different things at different times. And I wonder if you would agree with what I think about coming out the fog, that it's not something that applies to adoptees, it applies to every single person, just as to how much knowledge and experience they have about what the adoption process is like, what the severance is like.
Well, the fact of the matter is, with me, I didn't think about my daughter after she was adopted, and there was a period I went through of some reflection. But unlike some of the guys I interviewed subsequently and others I've read about, she wasn't, to be frank, she wasn't on my mind every day. In some cases, these children were on the minds of birth fathers every day. But there was times in my life, as I said to you earlier in my talk, looking back, God, I had a breakdown when I was, a certain age, and there were things that I now realise triggered that. I only realise that now. That were to do with the adoption, but I didn't have words for it then. I had no words to make the connections between the building blocks of what I in life I was going through, my struggles and troubles, and the fact that some 20 years before I'd given a child up for adoption, but because I believed that I was on it. I never forgot about her, of course, right? But nevertheless, it wasn't something that held me back. I made career choices. I travelled a lot, so I'm not that typical of many of the men I've talked about, but there is something about a fog that sometimes temporarily lifts and then goes back again. So things do change. I don't think we're ever static. I don't think we are. That's a poor answer. I'm sorry, Lindsay.
Well, I think that's a great answer. Thank you very much for sharing that. I find that it's very helpful when you meet other members of the triad, even if it's not your own triad, to help to empathise from what it's like to be in one of the other positions.
Yeah, sure, of course. When you're in the same room as somebody that's I was with a guy at lunchtime today. I have to say, I've known him for 20 years now. I helped find his mother. I helped discover what happened to his father, and sometimes you don't have to sort of repeat a certain language. There's the language that you can talk about that. With people, civilians, let's call them, who have nothing to do with adoption, don't get. There's a kind of language, and there's also, by the way, why I'm on about this, there's some language that I cannot stand now, some professional language. Birth mother, birth father has come from the professions. The word placement has come from professions. The word contact has come from the professions. Some come up for adoption, freed for adoption. These are phrases that I don't care for at all. But to go back to when you're making connections with people, me and Ricky today at lunchtime, we were kind of, you can just talk about stuff and things just come up and you know exactly what the other means. And it's weird. It's a kind of a secret society.
Thank you.
I'm glad you asked that, because I can go into a rant, right? And you might have to sort of put the hook out and get me off the screen.
There's Don's got a question for you.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for being here today. It's been really useful and interesting to hear your perspective. I think there's been one common theme, especially in the historic forced adoptions, is that the father's name was deliberately left off the birth certificate, obviously so that then whoever was dealing with the adoption didn't have to find the father to get his consent, and adoptees were led to believe, obviously I don't speak for every adoptee, but I speak as an adoptee, that obviously they were just not on the radar and that it was a result of a one night stand. And I think that's something we've heard over and over today, is that the commonality is that there's certain very strong common themes which we have said, and that the isolation of the mothers, the isolation of the fathers, the isolation of the adoptees, the lack of support, and it all seems to be very, very controlled. And I agree with you about the use of language, because it's something we go over very, very frequently. The use of language is just is dreadful. But thank you for today. It really did. I just sat and cried. But anyway, but thank you for that. Thank you,
Dawn. I mean, the thing about the birth certificates, if I may say so, is that it's when the father's name's not on it, literally he's a waste of space. Literally, he's not there. That space isn't filled in. And today, social workers still take referrals straight. They get the mum's information. They might even get the granny's information. They get the child's information. Do they ask if there's a father and what's the father's details? That depends. It's not routine, and I think that there's a kind of a feed through into a kind of, you know, and it's actually detrimental to women, of course, right? Because it makes them, they're the ones that are all to blame. Or it's childbearing and looking after children or not looking after them is all women's responsibility, and it's not proper. But certainly the lack of a name on a birth certificate is an awful kind of signal that you know, fathers, and then you fill that gap. That vacuum is filled. All vacuums are filled. You filled it with all sorts of nonsense about, you know, an older cad got the girl in trouble, and, you know, what's going on? Was it incest or was it this? All sorts of daft fantasies come, right? And you know, there's nothing I can do now about all these birth certificates, you know, but often one of the things that I would talk to about birth fathers that I worked with was that what's the option of having a negotiation? This is more complex, of course, because you have to talk to birth mother, adopted person. There's a lot more complexity to it, but it's often a very liberating thing to do, to have a name put on a birth certificate, and it is possible. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Is it?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you got that in there, Gary. I was just going to say, you can get your birth father's name put on your birth certificate. Yes, you can. Yes, as Gary says, it's not easy. It's not easy, but it can be done. It can be done. And actually, Gary, you might be able to tell me if I'm right or wrong. Commercial DNA will accept that. So I do think I know one case that's been allowed with commercial DNA. So that's a huge difference to other countries when the UK allow that, which I think is really, really good. I'm just checking, just going to give a quick double check, but I don't think there's any more questions directly in the chat. But I just wanted to say, Gary, thank you so much. I met you were one of the first people I met on this journey. I still remember that conversation. We could have spoken for another 4 hours and we still would still be putting the world to right. But I think it's amazing. Thank you so much for coming and sharing the story of birth fathers and how that perception is, because so many people don't hear it. It's lost in the noise. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Gary.